Welcome to Waging War, the podcast where we discuss the battle between truth and lies. We believe that if you know the truth will set you free.
Hello, welcome to Waging War. My name is Sarah Keel and I'm the Executive Director of Renew Clinic, and I am sitting here with Chad Sparks, who is the teaching elder of Providence Church, where I attend. I love it there. I have so much respect for Chad and his ability to teach the word and his knowledge, and you lead the congregation well in that way. So I'm very grateful for you.
You don't deserve that, but thank you very much.
I know it can be uncomfortable sometimes when people are like singing your praises, and you know you're working for the Lord, and it's like, do I say thank you? Or usually I'm just like, well, praise God. But nonetheless, he's working powerfully through how you lead and teach, and I just really appreciate it. So I'm grateful to have you here. So today we're going to talk a little bit about addiction, but we're going to get into pornography addiction specifically, but I want to lead into that. And as a pastor, I know you've talked to a lot of people, and I know you've seen a lot of things. I know you've read a lot of research. And so what would you say addiction is biblically, and even clinically from your perspective?
Man, that's a tough one. And let me just say, disclaimer here that I'm not a counselor, and I've taken one class on counseling. It was when I was master's degree in seminary. And that certainly doesn't qualify me as a counselor. But what is addiction? Addiction is an unhealthy dependence on a substance or anything it's unhealthy because it becomes something that is that I feel that I need, or that I start to need, and that's dependence. I depend on that, and it becomes unhealthy in many different ways. So a chemical addiction or a substance addiction can be detrimental to my physical well-being, but then also other addictions can be equally, if not in some cases more destructive to my life, my relationships to people, and my own well-being as far as my psychological and certainly my spiritual well-being. And when the dependence becomes such a god to me, becomes such an obsession of mine, that other things fall, that are necessary things, and we can define what necessary things are, but necessary and important things, other important things in my life, become slave to that, then it's destructive. It's destructive for who I am as a person. It's destructive for all the relationships that I have around me. It's destructive and can be physically to me, and even my own physical well-being in my body. I hope that even came close. You totally put me on the spot.
I know. Sorry, I know. And give a clinical explanation. Yeah. I know. I get it. Well, I mean, I think you described it well, because addiction, it's like a pleasure disease, where it's just misguided worship. I'm not going to the Lord when I'm feeling uncomfortable or for my fulfillment. I'm going to this or that. And, there's so many different types of addictions, I would say, and really idolatry, if we wanted to put a biblical word on it.
Isn't it interesting now that the word addiction can almost be used in a positive way by people who say, "Oh, I'm just so addicted to that, whatever series or something I'm watching on Netflix or whatever it is." It's just interesting how that is.
Right, exactly. And even like things like that we would even look at as good in culture: success, people pleasing. Climbing the ladder, having money. These are things that we are constantly chasing and building our life upon, that is a cheap substitute for the glory of God.
That's right, yeah. And
so addiction, I remember I was on a panel, and I remember, well, it's a prominent leader in our community. I won't say who, but I did not expect this from him. I asked the pastor on the panel, what do you say addiction is? I said to this person, it's a political leader. I said, you don't have to respond. And he said, no, I'm going to respond. Addiction is being out of relationship with Jesus Christ. And I was like, oh,
Whoa.
okay. All right. Did not expect that.
Wow.
But if you want to get down to the nitty gritty, and I think that the Lord is always replacing, guiding us as believers of taking our affections off this world and placing it on Him, because He's the one that can truly satisfy. Now, from the clinical world, a lot of times it gets very lopsided, right? You talked about how it affects the body, because it does. There's different stages to addiction. So there's use, abuse, dependence, and full-blown addiction where, if you're an alcoholic, you need medical treatment because your body is fully reliant on that alcohol. You could have a seizure and die if you don't have it. You can, there's hallucinations. I mean, there's a physical component to it that I think it develops into. But there's this argument that addiction, I've heard this dichotomy that addiction is a disease, it's not a moral failing, and I think that's a false dichotomy that's been created. And I think the thing that's being said underneath that is it has nothing to do with sin. It's just like if you get cancer or if you get, which all things are because of sin, but they look at addiction as something that should be looked at as diabetes or, all these physical things that, and when it gets to the point of withdrawal, it is a medical emergency that people need help with, and I get that. But the undercurrent of addiction is, placing our affections on things other than God.
And we're believers, and we understand that there is real spiritual warfare going on in this world.
Right.
And it's hard as believers who understand the spiritual warfare component of things, which is really, I believe, behind all of the things that we see. Paul talks about how, the battle's not against flesh and blood, but against powers and principalities and rulers and these forces of the darkness. And we know that that's Satan, who prowls around like a roaring lion seeking whom he may devour, and he hates us and he wants us to, why does Satan operate? This is probably for a different podcast, but Satan operates in a way that, God wants to bring glory to himself. Satan knows that God is in control. Satan knows he's read the end of the Bible. He knows what's going to happen to him. He knows he's got limited days. So what does he do? He's aligned against and has already lost the war against an almighty God who he ends up doing his bidding for him. So Satan has really two great things that he can do against God until his time is up. And one is to try to take glory away from God. And number two, to try to hurt those who are created in God's image. And if he can do those two things, if I'm thinking about what Satan gets up every morning, he doesn't get up every morning, but if he does, and he's thinking about what he's going to do today, I think that those are his priorities. He's going to try to take glory away from God, and he's going to try to hurt those who God created in his image. And that's addiction. Addiction is we have placed our affection. I love that you said that. We've placed our affections and our desires and our longings, and we have created dependencies on things that are not of God, that hurt me and hurt other people. And that is just exactly what Satan wants.
Yeah, so it's like a kill two birds with one stone kind of thing with addiction. It hurts the image bearers of God, and it does the work of robbing God for his glory, in the minds of his image bearers.
And that's what Satan sees, and that's what he wants. When the beautiful thing of an almighty sovereign God is that God is still, as Luther said, Satan is God, the devil's God's devil. And so even in addiction, even in Satan's ploys and his plots, God is still going to bring more glory to himself because of this addiction in my life. If I will yield to him, God will use this addiction in my life for his glory.
Absolutely.
Because the devil's still God's devil. And that must be frustrating to be the devil.
Oh, totally. I was just thinking the same thing, but I didn't want to empathize or anything with it. I'm just saying that's like there's no winning.
No winning.
Yeah, no winning. There's not a competition happening here.
Right. We don't have two, a good force and a bad force and the yin and the yang. We don't have, there's not that going on. We have God who's almighty, And for whatever reason, he's allowing Satan his time. And for whatever reason, he's allowing Satan to hurt a lot of people. And seemingly take glory away from God in this world. But it's all going to be for a purpose. And it's all going to be for the ultimate glorification of God in the greatest way. And we have to trust him in that.
That in itself brings me so much like joy.
And hope.
And like there's truly nothing to fear. Like there's truly nothing to dread. When you can see the larger story at play here.
Yes.
And that's one thing too, like at Renew Clinic, that we are inviting our participants out of this small little story that they're in and into this larger story. And it's not like a made up story. It is the story. It is the reality of what is happening here, that you have this isn't it. There is a life to come. And God has created you for a purpose, and he loves you. You're an image bearer. Like inviting them into this greater, more beautiful story.
Which the world doesn't have. All of the narratives that are out there. There's the LGBTQ narrative.
Yeah.
There's the secular narrative. There are all these different narratives, and they're seemingly so attractive to people today, and yet we have this narrative. There is this narrative. There's this good news that's the central aspect of this narrative that God has given us, and when we're so blessed to be able to have. It's beautiful.
What are some, I guess, permissible or common addictions outside of chemical addiction that you see or that you've dealt with or that you've seen in ministry or whatever, just in our culture? Like, what are some of those that you've seen?
Some of them are that just come to mind as soon as you say this, and we didn't talk about this beforehand, but some of those things are like addiction to the idea of perfect family, or addiction to the idea of this can be what I would use the term, it can be a false god to me. It can be an idol for me. If for example, I have the idea that a perfect family is something that I maybe didn't have as a child, and I desired that all my life. I dreamt about that. I wanted that, and I looked for that in a spouse, and we talked about that before we were married, and then we get married, and that becomes an idol, maybe for both of us. I know Darla and I, my wife, we struggle with making family such a high priority in our life, that then when we had a child that walked away from the things that we taught him, and it just crushed us. It absolutely crushed us, and we're asking the question: why are we so? Why are you cast down, O my soul? We were asking the question the psalmist asked so many times. And why were we cast down? Why were we distraught and destroyed? It's because we had created an idol out of family. Family had become an idol. So a good thing can be, and often is, good things can become an idol. You mentioned, in passing a few minutes ago, pornography. Pornography is something that is born out of a good desire that God gave us when he gave us in the first commission in the Bible, be fruitful and multiply. So he gave us this desire for a man for his wife, and for that desire is a healthy desire. Sex is a good thing. It's how we, it's how we have kids and populate the world. That's all these things are good things. That the devil will come along and then corrupt and cause us to have unhealthy longings for, in this case, the flesh of that. And there's this different kind of desire that takes over. And Satan is happy to give us counterfeits for the real thing. And to me, in ministry, what I see a lot of times is the result of the real thing being supplanted by a counterfeit that does not fulfill and it strays away from being what God says. This brings glory to me, and it brings you satisfaction and contentment. Ultimately, I think because we forget who is God, and we forget what our ultimate purpose is, and that is to bring him glory. And when we are bringing him glory, then we are finding satisfaction that we can only find. We're made to worship. Was it Blaise Pascal who said, we've all got the God-sized hole, the God-shaped hole, and nothing can fill the God-shaped hole except God. And when we try to fill it with something else, every single time. How many times do I have to learn this, in my own personal life?
Right.
How many times do I have to learn that anything I try to fill, that hole, that true one overarching desire with something else, then it's always going to leave me dissatisfied. But not just that. Satan will take it and say, no, you just need to focus on it more. And I'll focus on it and focus on it and focus on it. And then I walk away from God's desire and create these problems that oftentimes are addictions.
Yeah, it always leaves us wanting, like that's the difference between being satisfied and everything, like being full, right? And resting, and always being left wanting. And that's what these cheap substitutes do. Let's talk a little bit more about the pornography.
Yeah.
Because that's something I wanted to really focus on today. I had told you before we got started, I was discipling, mentoring a girl. This was several years ago, wasn't anything, not even in the state. And she had told me that she had a fiance who lived in a different state, and that because they were not sexually intimate together, because they lived so far apart, not because they weren't married, but because they lived so far apart, was their solution was to watch pornography together, like on the phone or something like that. And when I told her that is not okay, it's not healthy, that's lust, why do you want him looking at another woman? That's logically for me, but
kind of obvious, yeah.
Yeah, she was surprised. And this is a person who was a believer. Granted, she was very new in the faith, and some of these things were not, it just doesn't hit our conscience immediately. So I'm not saying she wasn't a Christian or anything like that. But she was surprised that I pushed back on it. And I think this speaks to the culture just normalizing sex in a way where it's just something, you can go get it when you want it, with who you want it, how you want it. And it's just something that has become normalized in our culture.
Yeah, no question. I mean, I talk about it a lot, like even as a pastor, as a preacher. I talk about this sexually insane world that we're in right now. And it's something that's been coming. It's always existed. It's always existed. Job, which is probably one of the oldest books of the Bible, maybe the first one that was actually written down, Job even says, I've made a covenant with my eyes not to look at a girl with lust. That it's never not been a problem. Looking with lust, as Job said and as Jesus said, has always been an issue, and particularly for men, which I think statistics bear that out. And it's this counterfeit, it's this twisting of something that's naturally okay, that we would be attracted to a woman, in our case as a man, or that we would be attracted to a woman. That's a natural thing, that we should love each other, that we should have that desire that culminates in a sexual relationship with one another is a healthy thing. It's a good thing. It's how we make babies. But that gets twisted, and in our culture in particular, I'm old now, so I can say things like this. But just in my lifetime, I've watched as the baby boomers. My mother was a baby boomer, and my dad actually was right before baby boom. My mom was right after the baby boomer generation began. And so that whole generation has been a generation where, beforehand, yeah, they did their, their pinups and their, they had their pornography as well. But something has happened with Larry Flynn and with the, Larry Flynn was the guy, I guess he was with Penthouse magazine or something like that, where he was able to bring to the court system and to say this is a matter of free speech, which enabled, particularly in the 1970s, this explosion of explicit pornography that began to be made available. I grew up. We're in West Knoxville. Right now we're at, I don't know if people know this or not, but we're in Farragut, right here where we are doing this interview, in this podcast. Less than a mile from here, less than a half a mile from here, there used to be this place called the Dixie Lee Junction Drive-In Theater. And I grew up less than a half a mile from this place right here. And me and my friends in middle school, Farragut Middle School, we could walk, telling our parents we were spending the night with each other, we could walk to the Dixie Lee Junction Drive-In Theater and watch XXX movies all night long. And to me, that was one of the worst things that ever happened in my upbringing. Because, and I'll just a little word of personal testimony here, I was a kid who was exposed to extremely vivid pornography when I was in the 70s, in the 1970s, when I was living in Farragut, Tennessee. And it's something that I have never been able to, like, it changed the course of many things in my life. Right. And so now, as a guy now that's in my 50s, and we live in a day where every kid's got a phone. I say every, but we know, most kids have a phone, and they're all connected to the internet, and in 2 clicks, they can get explicit porn. And it's visual. It's video of sex taking place and it's just available, and it's everywhere, and it's there. And not too long ago, it's about around Christmas time. The last time I was at the mall, but the malls aren't cool anymore. But I was at the mall looking for something. I think I was going to the Apple store, and I noticed these three teenage kids, the teenage boys that were sitting together in one of the little seating areas in the mall. And I thought, I bet those guys were looking at porn. They were all looking at their phone. And so I just slipped, just as sneaky as I could, I just slipped behind them while they weren't paying attention. Sure enough, they're looking at full-fledged, right there in the mall. But we shouldn't be surprised, because this is something that is happening all the time. It's the availability now of pornography is incredible. And it's wrecking people's lives. So now, as a pastor, hardly a week goes by where Jeff or I, he's over our counseling at our church, we'll have someone sitting in our offices. Many times it's multiple someones. Many times it's men who are talking and confessing to us an addiction to pornography, or that they got caught by their wife in pornography, or a couple that's sitting in front of me and they're talking about divorce, and when I get to the bottom of it, it's because she caught him in looking at pornography. And a 1,000 other scenarios where I'm seeing it just torpedo, particularly Christians in our culture today. And how is the devil doing this? With shame and guilt. Because when they get sucked into the pornography, which is a natural thing that has been distorted and become a god, and then become an addiction, and they begin to look at this thing, they get caught, because you ultimately will get caught. It will affect your other relationships. It always does. And there is this shame, even if it doesn't, even if you don't get caught, there's this shame that Christian men will feel. And what it does, I remember in the Christianity Today article of a few years ago that they're talking about the phenomenon of people going to passion concerts and things like this, young college-age, young adult men or people going to these passion concerts. And then finding out, somebody did a study of all the people at the passion concert, what percentage of them were involved in sexual relationships, explicit sexual relationships with their girlfriends, but how many of them were involved in pornography. And it was some astronomical number, like approaching 90% of those that are Christians going to concerts, going to passion, conferences. And then they've interviewed one of the young men who admitted to having this lifestyle, this dichotomy going on. And he said, what it does is it rips my guts out. And what he meant by that quote, "it rips my guts out," is that he has no boldness as a Christian. He can't take a stand for his faith. He can't lead as a man because of this dark secret of porn that he's living with all the time, that the enemy is just crucifying him over and over and over and telling him how shameful you are, how terrible you are. Who are you to lead this girlfriend of yours in prayer? Who are you to try to go before God? Who are you to ask God for forgiveness one more time, knowing that you're going to go back? And this feeling, in a sense, I've always asked myself, why was it that I grew up in Farragut near Dixie Lee Junction Drive-In Theater? Part of it, I think, for me, is in that rebellious period of my life when me and my friends were seeing things that most people didn't have access to our age at that time. And God's sovereignty was to allow me to experience the the beginnings of addiction to a thing that was later on in my later life as a pastor, I'm going to see everybody addicted to. Everybody was going to be experiencing this same addiction that God allowed me to be kind of a, an early adapter of this kind of addiction, this kind of deception, this kind of destruction that the devil was going to bring upon the entire culture. And so that's one reason why I've been brought into this whole thing, I think, by God. Another reason is that I was asked by a sister nonprofit organization here in Knoxville. It's a Christian organization to Renew Clinic, is Street Hope. And Street Hope TN is Tennessee's, one of Tennessee's only, and has started the only safe house for those children that have been rescued from sex slavery. And so there's much more I can say about that, but I was on the board of Street Hope. And that time president, executive director of the organization came to me and said, Chad, I think you need to be leading a men's initiative to address pornography. If we're going to stop child trafficking and sex trafficking, every indicator is showing that on both the supply end and the demand end, we have pornography. So on the supply end of it, there is this, the fact that up to 3/4 of all child pornography, underage pornography that takes place, the people that are involved in that are being forced into that. So there is a slavery component, and even in those that are of age, they are addicted to drugs, or they're doing pornography not because they want to. Nobody wakes up nobody wakes up in their life and says, one day I'm going to be a porn star. I don't think.
Right.
Or I'm going to be abused by some man on camera. That's what I want to grow up and be one day. No, this is something that is driven by people who are being trafficked, people who are being, abused. So one of the things that then results from this is, how do I, as a Christian, as a pastor, approach this issue when I'm outraged, I'm angered, I'm concerned about the way that pornography is. I know, and I can see the faces of men in my congregation who have come to me, or who I know have got this going on in their life, and there's this dichotomy going on here. There's this anger that I have that has to be addressed by preaching to the people and telling people this is a danger, this is hard, this is horrible, this is a sin that Satan is fooling you with. And on the other hand, how do I address it in such a way that I don't turn up the shame heat, and I don't dissuade people from seeking help and being honest and being transparent and saying, look, I've got a problem and I need to address this, and inviting people to people, to others in the church, and pastors in the church, and leaders and elders in the church, and counselors, and even places like Renew Clinic, to get this. I invite you, come. You don't have to live in this. So there's this tugging that of both things that are happening right now, and so just to address that, let me say it is difficult. In our outrage, we can, unmeaningly, we can accidentally, not intending, we can push people away. And that's why there's this thing called grace that Jesus offers, that is intrinsic to the gospel. This is why, again, that the gospel is the answer. The gospel is the answer is because in my sin, in my shame, in my failure, he doesn't look at me with condemnation. While I'm living as a Christian, looking at porn, I'm in Romans chapter 7, and I'm doing the thing that I do not want to do, but I can't continue to do it. That's Romans 6. Shall we go on sinning that grace might increase? By no means. That alone is what spurs me to Romans 7 okay, so I'm a Christian, I shouldn't be doing this. Shame, shame, shame. Romans 7 happens where I just find myself in this unending, cycle of failure and shame and failure and shame and failure and shame and anger at myself and defeat. But then there's Romans 8. Thank God for Romans 8.
Yeah.
Which begins, there is therefore now no condemnation through Christ. He says, come to me, all you who are weary and heavy laden, and I'll give you rest. That's the Jesus that we have. That's why Christianity is the way. That's why Jesus is the way. There is no other way than that holds up high this high true statement of live this way and you find fulfillment, with the acknowledgement of our inability in ourselves to do it, yet offers us grace and power from Him to do it for us. So His grace comes in where my power fails. And His grace comes in not to shame me, but to love me. His grace comes in to give me power and strength to do, and gives me desire for holiness again if I've lost that desire that maybe I didn't even have before. And it's constant surrender to Him. To go back to the Beatitudes, and that I think if we read it as a process, there's this constant surrender. So when we talk about Jesus being the way, when we're inviting, and I'm saying I'm talking about the church, me as a pastor, when I'm inviting people to Jesus as the answer, He is not just the answer to my poor thinking of this is okay and me saying sin's okay. No, I know that in my heart. I don't have to be told that again. But it's the brokenness in that leads me to the one answer Jesus, who by His grace I can come to Him. He will in no wise cast me out. He loves me. I can confess my sins. He is faithful and just to forgive me my sins and cleanse me from all unrighteousness. He will take my sins as far as the east is from the west. He will, cast them in the deepest, darkest sea. He will do all of these things that Scripture says that's true. And then He will take that and give me power and strength and ministry, meaning like He'll give me purpose in this. So now my purpose as a believer is somehow formed in the story that I didn't want, by the story that I didn't want, to make me into the person that God wanted me to be. And as Christians do that, as we continue to do that, as we continue to offer this way, this truth, this life, then it's the only hope for our culture. Mm-hmm. So the answer is, I can't be negative. I have to call it sin, while always offering the grace that is intrinsic to the gospel, which is the answer. Mm-hmm. And to do that with love and to do that with joy. It is a challenge for me because I am outraged. I hate the fact that these children are being abused and they've been held in slavery. It's a side of me that I have to deal with all the time. My wife will come home from being at Garland Oaks, and seeing these girls and telling me the stories of these girls and how abusive and how awful and how the many, many layers of garbage they're having to face and go through in their restoration. And then for me to look at the guy who's the porn addict and the addicts that are in our church and in this world and everywhere around us right now. How do I do that and still be able to look at them with love? It's only through Christ.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Because somehow He, the perfect one, became sin for us, that through Him we might become the righteousness of God.
Amen. And you know how the two ministries are also very closely connected, or a lot of the people that we're serving were those kids.
Yes.
That were abused.
Yes. Early childhood trauma
right.
is maybe the most difficult and most prevalent factor mm-hmm. in many behavioral disorders and in many other disorders, even addictions, but also prison.
Right.
There's just that early childhood trauma stuff
Right.
is harsh. It's terrible. And,
Right.
and this trauma is worse than, in my opinion,
Yeah.
someone who is, as a child, has faced many, many, many sexual abusers.
Yeah.
I can barely talk about it without getting emotional. You know, it's devastating.
It's
So
evil.
Christians have to be outraged.
Mm-hmm.
We should be outraged. We must be outraged. We can't stand for it. We can't let Nazi Germany happen. We can't let, antebellum South Civil War, pre-Civil War happen. This is our slavery.
Mm-hmm.
But it must be met with not anger, but with the grace of God.
Mm-hmm.
Because that's our only hope.
Mm-hmm.
And it's the answer.
It is. To wrap this up, what would you say to the man or woman who could be watching this or listening whenever, who is currently struggling with a pornography addiction?
Yeah, get open. I mean, the first step is to be open. Find somebody that you can talk to and tell them, I've got a problem, and be honest about that. And why do I say this? And maybe the first step is acknowledge it just before the Lord. Jesus gave us in the Sermon on the Mount, so that the most important man in the world, and the most important speech that he ever gave, and the most important part of that speech is called the Beatitudes to the Sermon on the Mount of Jesus. And in that, I think is, whether Jesus intended it this way or not, there is this process that he spells out that I think works for every addiction, but certainly for the sake of pornography. And how can I say that? Because right after his introduction to the Sermon on the Mount, which is the Beatitudes, one of the first things he says is, you've heard that it was said, do not look at a woman with, or to do not commit adultery. But I say to you, don't look at a woman with lustful intent. He addresses pornography immediately after the Beatitudes. In that context, I think it's safe and helpful to look at the Beatitudes as a process. And we don't have time to delve into that here. But to me, that's what are the Beatitudes? They're the blesseds. They're eight statements on blessing that, if you take them as a process, they're a pathway, and I believe that lead to the satisfaction. That's what the word blessed, makarios, is the Greek word. It means satisfaction, contentment. And if Jesus starts his most important speech ever with this, and the next thing after it is, you've heard that it was said, don't commit adultery, but if you look upon a woman lustfully, you've already committed adultery. We've got something here that we need to pay attention to. And how does it start? It starts off with blessed, happy, satisfied, content are the poor in spirit. Well, that was totally shocking. Nobody had ever heard anybody, no Jewish teacher had ever said anything like that before. Poor in spirit. What does that mean? It means spiritually bankrupt. I've got to acknowledge the fact that I have no hope on my own. I can't do this. I am spiritually bankrupt. I need God. I don't have it within me. And so acknowledging that is the beginning. Blessed are the poor in spirit. Blessed are those who mourn. We know that sin breaks us. Pornography rips our guts out, as the guy said. We are broken, and that is a good place to be. God will not despise a broken spirit, David said in Psalm 51, the greatest confession song that's ever been written. A broken and despised spirit. So the poor in spirit, but then mourning my sin. Then the next step, I'm abbreviating this, but the next step after that is blessed are the meek. Now, what is the meek? It's a Greek word, praus, and it literally, it's a hard thing to translate into English because there's really not an English equivalent. But it's the idea of a wild animal that's surrendered to a master. And I think that a better English word, and I've taken Greek and Hebrew, but I'm by no means am I an expert in language. But in my studies, I think that the best way to translate praus today is surrendered. It's someone who's surrendered. So I recognize my sin. I can't beat it on my own. I hate my sin and I grieve it, and then I surrender. Surrender to who? Surrender to Christ. Surrender to the one who's telling me, who's giving me this how to be blessed. He is God. He's the one who came to set the captives free. He is the answer to all the things in the Bible, pointing forward to this Messiah that's going to bring things, all this brokenness is going to be fixed by this guy. He does it on the cross for us, our sin. Then the next thing, and I can't go through all 8 of them, but the next thing is, blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. I can't truly hunger and thirst for righteousness until I have this relationship with God who takes my sinful nature. I still going to struggle with my sinful nature, but He puts His Spirit in me and He cleanses me, and He, as far as my perception before Him, He sees me as being cleaned, as God's, as being washed by Jesus' blood. Now He gives in me this desire for holiness and this desire. And with this, and that, so you can kind of see there's this process.
Yeah.
And how do we do that without Jesus? How do we walk out of, how do we go from addicted, whether that's to a substance or whether that's to pornography, and to health and joy and peace and contentment and satisfaction, blessedness without Jesus? And well, the answer is, I think, we can't. And that's why I love Renew Clinic. Renew Clinic sees that the gospel's the answer, that Jesus is the answer. And as long as we don't apologize for that, as long as we don't backtrack from that, as long as we view all the other solutions through the lens of Jesus as the ultimate solution, there's hope.
Yeah.
And people can be helped. And you know what? We're already seeing it.
Yeah.
We're already seeing it in Renew Clinic, and we're already seeing it with, even at Providence with these guys that are, they think, hopelessly addicted to pornography.
Yeah. And that's what Satan wants us to believe.
Yeah.
That the bad thing's the end of the story. But it's just not.
It's not.
It's just not.
And then it's great that God would even use it in our lives.
I know.
He's using it in your life.
Yeah.
He's using it in my life.
Exactly.
And it's a beautiful thing that He would take brokenness and turn it into something that He can use,
I know. And praise God, He works that way.
He does.
I mean, I'm just, part of the good news to me is just who He is.
Yes.
Just realizing that the God who created us came to us, that He, shed His own blood for us. That's good news in itself, that our Creator is so loving and good and powerful and sovereign and all the things, and so there's always
and
hope.
He loves us when we don't deserve it.
Right.
I mean,
right.
so you asked me how do you advise guys? That's it. Go to Jesus.
Yeah.
Acknowledge your sin, yes. Tell somebody about it, yes. But go to Jesus.
This has been Waging War. Thanks for fighting alongside us this week.